All right. Well, this lesson is all about organic chemistry, or primarily the organic chemistry molecules. All living organisms are made up of a variety of different kinds of molecules. But what it really comes down to is there is just a core group that do the main jobs within all living organisms. Let's move forward to the next slide to sort of begin to give you a preview of this. You'll notice here that this is the periodic table. You learned about that at least a little bit in middle school. Well, here we've taken it and we've rearranged it. We've rearranged it with the focus being on one element, and that element being carbon. Now, carbon is what's known as the backbone element of all living organisms. Thus, it's in the center of our new periodic table, the organic chemistry periodic table. And you see there's a few other elements: hydrogen, oxygen, sulfur, nitrogen, phosphorus, and a handful of others that are all kind of linked together with the focus being on carbon. Thus, when we think of biology, just remember, as Mr. Spock would say, we are a carbon-based life form. Now, the rest of my lesson is going to focus on the four main groups of organic molecules. Turns out that, again, when you think of yourself as a collection of different molecules. Really, it comes down to there's four primary groups with a few other micronutrients mixed into the bunch, but there's four that do the major jobs within living organisms. So let's start with the first one. First one is carbohydrates. Carbohydrate, carbon with water. Basically, long carbon chains surrounded by water molecules. In order to build carbohydrates, you need simple sugars. Scientists like to call those simple sugars by the term monosaccharide. All right? Monosaccharides can come in a variety of different ones. The most important one for our purposes will be glucose. We'll see glucose come up in a number of ways throughout the year, but glucose is the simplest sugar you can get. It comes down to basically glucose is six carbons and 6 waters linked together, C6H12O6. There are other sugars, and here's an easy way to remember whether or identify something as a sugar. Look for that OSE suffix. So you have things like fructose, found in fruits, lactose, found in milk, maltose, found in grains like wheat and barley. Anytime you see OSE, you know that that's going to be a sugar. And so carbohydrates are all built from linking different numbers of these various sugars together. And once you do that, you end up with a carbohydrate. So let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about why are they important. Well, it really comes down to one word: energy. E-N-E-R-G-Y. Energy for all living organisms. When a living creature, whether it be single-celled or multi-celled, looks for energy, it seeks out a carbohydrate. And when it seeks out a carbohydrate, it will then pull apart that carbohydrate to get to the monosaccharides that it was built from. And when it does that, it will then rearrange that monosaccharide, that glucose, in order to release energy that could be utilized by living organisms. We'll talk more about this respiration chemical reaction later in this unit, but for now, just remember, every time you hear the word carbohydrate, think energy. Now, what are some of the types of carbohydrates? I'm going to list 3 of them for this lesson, but again, these are 3 important ones. First, we'll go with starch. The science word for starch is polysaccharide, many sugars. And so when we look at all the different starches that we might come across in our diets, each of those is made from a varying amount of monosaccharides chemically bonded together. And so starches can come in lots of different forms. But the bottom line is, when we look at a starch, it's an energy molecule. As we yank off those sugars, we can then use those in respiration to get the energy that we need. Then we have two others, glycogen and cellulose. Now, I put glycogen in here because it's kind of an interesting one. It's utilized in our liver, and it's the energy molecule that drives our liver to do the 200 different jobs that a liver does. A liver is a very complex organ, and it needs, it turns out, a special form of energy which scientists know as glycogen. The other molecule, the other type of carbohydrate I wanted to mention, is called cellulose. Now, what cellulose needs to be recognized as, it's a plant carbohydrate. So this cellulose is used by plants in a variety of ways. It is used for energy. It is also occasionally used for, or is used for building cell walls, the structural component that holds cells, holds plants together. We are not able to access the energy in cellulose as humans. There are animals who do. Animals such as ruminants like horses, sheep, cows, goats, etc. But cellulose is an energy molecule used in plants. Some animals are, with help from a few microorganisms, able to access it. And so here's the first, so now we've got the first organic molecule of significance, carbohydrates. Number two, lipids. Now lipids, you'll notice, are built around, starting with carbon. They've got hydrogen, oxygen, and then phosphorus. And again, phosphorus provides in many lipids the link to hold the components together. So just like before, let's talk about how we build a lipid. To build a lipid, again, we need two parts. We need what's known as a fatty acid chain, and we need a glycerol molecule. Now, different lipids are built with different numbers of fatty acid chains. Some have one, some have two, some even have three. Again, if we look at this diagram, you can see on the very left the molecular components of all those carbons, hydrogens, oxygens, and even the phosphorus building in this lipid here, which was a form of lipid known as a phospholipid. I'll talk more about that in just a little bit. At one end you've got the glycerol, at the other end you've got the, in this case, two fatty acid chains held together in the middle with that phosphorus or phosphate grouping. Lipids, all lipids are built in the same manner. The only variation in lipids is whether they have one, two, or even three fatty acid chains holding them together. So now let's talk about what the job or function of these molecules is. The function of these molecules is to store energy for living organisms, right? And so whenever you think of lipids, think storage. So when an organism takes in its food, such as us, when heterotrophs take in food, if they don't use all of the energy in that food, they convert it to a lipid. And then at some point in the future, if they need energy, they go find that lipid. What they'll generally do is convert it into a carbohydrate and then break that carbohydrate down into its monosaccharides. So they're an energy storage molecule. And they're what we go to secondarily if we need energy. We go to carbohydrates first. Second, we go to whatever we've stored up as lipids. Two other secondary uses for lipids is insulation and protection. So lipids provide a layer of insulation to help an organism maintain homeostasis with its environment. We have a layer of fat under our skin. Whales have a blubber under theirs. in order to prevent them from, again, losing heat to the environment. And so this layer of insulation is important for that process of homeostasis, allowing the organism to, again, maintain some balance, equilibrium with its environment. Another secondary use is protection. You know, we all have some lipid in our body. We have a layer of lipid around our essential organs, under our skin. It provides some cushion. It provides some barrier in order to prevent any damage to those various organs. Those are secondary uses. But no matter what, even if they're used for insulation, even if they're used for protection, they can still then be taken out of that role and then converted down into carbohydrates and then into sugars for energy. So we've got two now. Now we've got two different organic molecules. First one, carbohydrates provide energy. Second, lipids store energy and then get turned into carbohydrates whenever energy is needed. Now there are a few types of them. I just want to talk briefly about these. The first type of, well, I'm just going to list them for a moment. Waxes, steroids, fats, oils, and phospholipids. You're familiar with waxes, earwax, beeswax, you know, fats. You know, you see fat marbling in meat, fat, you know, in bacon, oils. We've got a whole variety of vegetable oils, from olive oil to canola oil to corn oil. And then, you know, the bottom line is the difference between a fat and an oil is how many, okay, molecules, how many carbon chains we've got there. The more carbon chains we have, it becomes a fat or a wax. Scientists recognize or separate fats as being solid at room temperature, oils being liquid at room temperature. So think margarine versus butter. You leave a stick of margarine on the counter, eventually it's going to turn to a puddle of oil. You leave butter on the counter made of fat, it's going to get soft, but it's still going to keep its solid state. Just mentioned steroids. Steroids, again, built in a similar manner, and so they are classified as lipids. These are molecules, as you know, can drive a variety of different reactions and changes inside the body. And then phospholipids, I mention those because that's what every cell membrane is made of, and we'll come later this year and talk about the cell membrane, but it's the primary barrier between the cell and its environment, and so it kind of functions as a way to control what enters and leaves the cell. So we've got these different types of lipids. Now I want to talk about the third group of organic molecules, nucleic acids. Turns out that, again, you can probably guess where you'd find these, the nucleus of the cell, thus nucleic acid. Nucleic acids turn out to be, or at least one of them, the largest organic molecule made by any living organism. I'll get to that in a minute. So these guys can be extremely large. They're made of, again, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, always common in organic molecules. And then we've got nitrogen and phosphorus in there. The phosphorus and nitrogen make up two of the components that are used to build a nucleic acid. So let me move forward and talk a little bit about how do you build a nucleic acid. In order to build it, like everything else, there's going to be subunits. The subunits of every nucleic acid is basically a sugar. You notice the OSE ending in that suffix, deoxyribose. So there's the most common one being deoxyribose. There's a phosphate, and there's something called a nitrogen base. The deoxyribose and the phosphate are used to provide a, quote, backbone to the molecule. The nitrogen base is where all of the core of the molecule is located in terms of what its job is in living organisms. So let's look at these two here. These are two types of nucleic acid, DNA and RNA, and you'll notice that they've got a sugar phosphate backbone, They've got those nitrogen bases in the middle, and really the only difference is that in one you've got two backbones, and the other you've got a single backbone. I'll talk more about both of these in just a moment. So let's look and focus in on both of them. Let's start with the DNA. Okay. DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, is its formal name, and it contains what we know as the genetic information of an organism. You can think of DNA as being the hard drive of the cell. The hard drive is where you store everything that you want on your computer. All the information for that computer, it's stored on a hard drive. Well, that's what DNA is. It stores every piece of information that cell needs to do any job that might be out there. And so DNA contains a lot of information. And we'll talk later this year about how much and you know, a lot more about how DNA works as a storage site for information and how it functions. Okay? But the bottom line is, think of it as the hard drive of the cell. Well, like anything, a hard drive is only as good as the software that can read it. Well, RNA, ribonucleic acid, it just uses a different sugar to make the nucleic acid, but it is what reads the information. So you can think of it kind of almost like the software. So it reads the information and then provides a way for the cell to use that information. Now it turns out, what's the information about? The information is about making a protein. We haven't talked about proteins yet, but we'll get to those here shortly. And so you've got two molecules here, DNA being the larger of the two because it has every piece of information in the cell, RNA being the smaller of the two because it only takes small bits of information out to the factories inside the cell where they can use the information to make something. So now we've got a third type of organic molecule, okay? An information molecule, or a molecule focused on providing information to the living organism. Which leads us to our very last organic molecule, proteins. Proteins, again, built from carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Once again, we've got sulfur in there now. We've got some nitrogen, but sulfur is the real key because sulfur is what twists and turns all of those carbon atoms to create unique shapes to allow the proteins to do what they need to do. So let's talk about proteins here. How do we make a protein? Well, once again, we have to use a subunit. We have to use or build a protein from something smaller. And what we use to build a protein? Amino acids. Scientists have learned that there are 20 different amino acids used by living organisms, and so the unique combination of amino acids that is used will determine the unique type of protein that is created. Okay, so there's 20 different amino acids, some of which we can make in our bodies, living organisms can make, others we need to get from our diet. But all of them in different combinations are used to build a protein. To talk for a minute about how do you make an amino acid. I'm going to kind of run through this because it's not super important, but it is worth noting that all amino acids are made of pretty much the same parts. You've got an amino group, you've got a carboxyl group, and you've got a hydrogen group. And so, again, there's the amino group. I've highlighted that in those orange boxes, and you'll notice that they're pretty much the same for each one. Okay, so we've got that one. Then we'll come back to carboxyl. So there it is highlighted in yellow. Okay, and you'll notice it's the same for all 4 of these examples of amino acids. And then, of course, we've got our hydrogen. Again, I highlighted that one in green. So all 4 of these examples have the same 3 components for the first 4. And then scientists identify the last component as an R group, R being sort of the word used for variable. And every R group is going to be unique to each amino acid, and therefore the R group, as you see in this example, they're highlighted in blue, the R group is going to be what separates out each amino acid, allowing it to bond in certain ways and create unique and different proteins. And so each of these R groups is different. Every one of the 20 amino acids will have a different R group. So now we know what we use to make a protein, amino acids, of which there are 20 and only 20. Let's talk about what their job is. Their job is to basically run the cells, the basic unit of living organisms. Anything that needs to get made generally is made of a protein. Any job that needs to get done is done by a protein. You need to digest your food. You need a chemical to break it down, carry out the chemical reaction. That chemical is a protein. You need to make some more muscle tissue to be able to allow your bones to move and your body to move a little faster. Muscle is made of protein. Okay? You need, to protect your skin from ultraviolet rays. When the ultraviolet rays hit your skin, they trigger a chemical reaction to produce melanin, a protein that absorbs some of that UV light and therefore can act as a way to protect your skin somewhat. Anytime you have some job getting done or something being built, it's being built by, a protein. And so let me give you a few other examples here, in order to help you understand what I mean by the functioning and structure. So let's start with keratin. You know what your fingernails are. Those fingernails are built of protein that are designed to be rigid, designed to protect the end of your fingers, to allow them to avoid getting damaged for all the uses that we need our fingers for. That's a protein. Okay? Keratin is found in the horns of various animals. And again, it's still the same protein. Another one, fibroin. Anytime you see a spider webs are made of this protein called fibroin. Fibroin is an incredibly strong protein. Spiders use that protein that in order to catch their prey, hold on to their prey, and therefore provide them with a means of eating it at their leisure. One of my favorites is luciferase. Lovely name. It's a chemical that does a chemical reaction. So it's a molecule that carries out a chemical reaction in fireflies. What it does is it's basically a molecule that carries out a chemical reaction in fireflies that produces molecules that will allow the firefly to produce light from its tail. And so its job is to function in terms of rearranging certain molecules that the firefly has. Those molecules then that are being produced are ones that will give off the familiar light that we see in the tail of the firefly. And then we have your muscles, actin and myosin. These muscles work in tandem to allow your muscles to move your bones. As the actin and myosin bond to each other, that will cause your muscles to contract and your bones will move in one direction. Once they've moved and you want to move them back to their original position, the actin-myosin bonds are released or broken, and the actin-myosin moves your bones in another direction. The variety of different muscles in your body are all made of these two proteins. So again, you've got keratin building a structure, fibroin building a structure, luciferase carrying out a job, actin and myosin building a structure. I could go on and on. Amylase in your saliva, digesting starches in your mouth. Okay? Pepsin in your stomach, carrying out a chemical reaction to break down fats, okay, that you eat, that are found in your food. All right? I mentioned melanin, okay? All of these are proteins either doing a job, carrying out a chemical reaction, or building some sort of structure. So now we've got to kind of summarize here just for a moment as I close this out. Every organic molecule, every living creature, is made up of these four groups. Carbohydrates, providing energy. Lipids, storing energy. DNA, providing information, and proteins, building structure and carrying out chemical reactions. If you can remember that, then you can basically understand how you're built.